It's good to be gathering again together. We just sort a few things out here. And we're going to just spend some time once again reflecting on this passage that is, I think, so relevant for us as we begin to regather and as we look to God to lift us up and to refresh us once again. And I trust whether you're at home or following on the live stream here in person, that as we begin to just again reflect on Isaiah's words in Isaiah 40, that you'll sense something of God's Spirit afresh in and through His Word. We believe that God revives us through His Word as well as directly as we engage with Him in the presence of the Spirit. So we're going to continue this theme of lifted. And I want to begin by sharing actually a story that hit the news. This is a story about a race in the ultra running world that is a very obscure race, but actually very recently, about a week ago, this very obscure race hit the headlines, or at least made the news feeds in the BBC and that. And this is what Reuters reported. 2 British ultra runners smashed the world record by covering more than 330 miles of a 4.2-mile course in Suffolk, England, with 41-year-old John Stocker taking the ultimate honours as the last man standing. There he is, John Stocker. Stocker and the 35-year-old Matt Blackburn were among a field of 123 who set off at noon local time on Saturday in the Suffolk Backyard Ultra, a style of event growing in popularity where athletes complete a set loop as many times as they can. The race in eastern England featured a 4.2-mile trail loop that had to be completed inside an hour. The distance is calculated to total 100 miles in 24 hours. Participants must be back in time to start the next loop or they are knocked out. When the third surviving runner called it a day after 38 laps, do your maths, 38 times 4.2. Kids in the room who are good at maths, maybe you can come up with an answer by the end. Participants must be back in time to start the next loop or they are locked out. By Tuesday afternoon, they had passed the previous world record of 75 hours, set by Belgian dentist Karel Saab in October. Ultra runners and mesmerized observers around the world became gripped online by the astonishing performances in a small-scale event as neither man was prepared to stop. Both runners kept completing their loop with no apparent sign of slowing down and then set out on another. Most laps were completed in around 40 to 50 minutes, averaging out 47 minutes, allowing a few minutes of rest and refueling to be patched up again by their dedicated helpers. The world record came and went before finally Blackburn rang the bell to signal that he could no longer go on, and he slumped into his chair, having covered 333.3 miles. Stocker, however, still had to complete his 81st lap of 4.2 miles, or by the harsh rules of backyard events, there would be no winner. He duly did, as his 81st and final lap took him to an astonishing final distance of 337.5 miles, finishing after 2000 local time on Tuesday. It's a unique race, and it is deliberately designed to level out the playing field. It's not the fastest who win, it's not the fittest, it's certainly not the thinnest. It's the last man or woman actually standing, because a female runner has actually won this race format in the past few years. And it's based on the premise that while we may be able to keep on going, sometimes for extraordinary lengths of time, every one of us will grow weary at the end of the day, and we all faint. None of us are everlasting, are we? You know, I think we're a bit like batteries. Some of us are bog standard, ever-readies. Some may be Duracells. Some may be super-powered lithium batteries. But at some point, we all run out of charge. That's part and parcel of what it means to be human. And so we all need recharging from time to time. And the words that Isaiah prophesies in chapter 40 highlight and underline our need of a recharge from God at times. And God's willingness to do that, to draw us near to himself. So let's read the words of Isaiah 40, verse 25 onwards. And then I just want us to reflect particularly this morning on what this says about our need to admit our human weakness and need of God. So Isaiah chapter 40, verse 27 onwards we'll read. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and they shall not faint. We're thinking about the need through these words to be lifted, aren't we? And we're considering this wonderful invitation, this holy, everlasting, inexhaustible God who invites us to stretch out our wings and to come to him at a time when we feel desperately depleted, to be renewed and restored, to be lifted up once again. We need the wind of God afresh in our sails, don't we? If we're going to live out this life of discipleship with enthusiasm and vision and purpose. And do you know what? That's what we are called to. To live lives that are energized by the Spirit, that are devoted to him and to his church, contributing to his purpose, playing our part within his body, building one another up in love, acting as agents of his kingdom wherever he's placed us. That's the life of the Spirit. We're not called to be those hummingbirds that we talked about last week who are living on a frantic knife edge of burnout as they desperately try to replenish their own internal energies. Neither are we called to be chickens, birds that have wings but don't ever really get to fly. No, we're called to be eagles, to be receptive and responsive, those who feel and enjoy the uplift of God's Spirit in our lives, who draw on and are sustained by God's resources, who know what it means to come again and again and again to that fountain to drink from. And so let me encourage you, if you are in a state of spiritual torpor, if your tank is empty, as I know many of our tanks are, if your well is dry, if you're in a rut, if you're stuck in your pajamas, or if you are weighed down with weariness, there is an invitation for you to come, to stretch out those wings again, to feel the uplift of God's Spirit on you as a disciple. The invitation's not to try harder. The invitation's not to come off spiritual furlough and get back to work again. No, the invitation's to come and drink. Come to the fountain. Come to the inexhaustible one. Come to the everlasting God. The one who's gentle and lowly, and the one who said, "Take my yoke upon you. For my yoke's easy, my burden is light." Isaiah's prophecy was written to a people in a dreadful state of despondency. And you know, we can feel very weak. We can feel at times very despondent and depressed and disappointed. Well, God's heart for us at those moments is to come to us and to lift us up again. Isaiah 40 is a beautiful chapter. I would really recommend you reading the whole chapter. Do you know how it begins? It begins with these wonderful words: comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. It goes on to speak of how God in his gentleness carries us at times like a shepherd carries his lambs in the folds of his garment. It's a beautiful chapter. It's a wonderful invitation. It's full of a wonderful vision of who God is in his inexhaustible nature, but it's full of that wonderful, tender-hearted, compassionate, outreaching invitation to us to come and find strength in him again, to be comforted, to be strengthened. I want us to reflect a little on our frailty and dependency, because this is very much part of how we get to that place of being lifted up again. It's through admitting the reality of where we are at, when we are spiritually dry and when the tank is empty. And if we're not coming out of the last 15 months realizing that we're more frail and fragile than perhaps we thought we were, then I shudder to think what it will take for us to acknowledge our desperate dependency as human beings. If we are, however, coming out of the last 15 months with a greater sense of our own weakness and our need of God, and if that's reflected in the way in which we are far quicker to come to him in our need and to pray to him, then I believe something extremely valuable has happened in our lives over this season. It's an important lesson, a timely lesson. Our Western modern society in many ways is built on the assumption that we have the resources and the wisdom within ourselves to cope with whatever life throws our way. We have our own solutions, we have our own wisdom, we have our own resources. We can make ourselves better people. You heard that phrase, become a better version of yourself? We can make our world a better place. We can make it more prosperous. We can make it more just. And then a virus comes along. The smallest of all microbes. So small that 100 million of them can fit on a single pinhead. And it suddenly threatens not just our personal health, but our entire societies, our healthcare systems, our economies, our freedoms. We're discovering perhaps that we are a lot more fragile than we thought we were. That we're subject as human beings in a very real way with intrinsic weakness. And you know, that's the way of the kingdom. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said these words. And that Sermon on the Mount was as countercultural in his day as it is to our own ears. He said these words. He said, blessed are who? The poor in spirit. You feel poor in spirit? You feel depleted? You feel desperate? You feel dry? You feel empty? You feel poor in spirit? You're blessed. And yours is the kingdom of heaven. He went on to say, blessed are those who mourn. You feel a sense of grief in your heart for what you've gone through and what we have gone through. Perhaps even a personal grief for the way that this has impacted your own life. You're blessed. You'll be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You hear what Jesus is saying here? It's not blessed are the go-getters, blessed are the troubleshooters, blessed are the resourceful. No, at the heart of being a member of God's kingdom is a happy acknowledgement of our own intrinsic weakness. And perhaps one of the key lessons of this last 15 months is to bring us to that kingdom acknowledgement. God, we are intrinsically weak. We are desperately in need. Well, that's what qualifies us to enjoy the blessings that God has in store for us. Isaiah speaking to a people who are realizing this afresh. So in what ways do perhaps we need lifting up? What are some of the ways in which we're experiencing this weakness? Let me suggest 3, and then we're going to pray with one another. First of all, spiritual distance. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way's hidden from the Lord, my rights disregarded by God? You know, that's quite a conclusion to come to, isn't it? I mean, the people who are as the prophet prophesies, saying that kind of thing, are God's chosen people. They have a rich history of God's intervention. They can trace their spiritual lineage back to Abraham, their father, who was called to be the father of a chosen people, a chosen nation. They can look back on Egypt and Moses and those great encounters, those great interventions, the crossing of the Red Sea. They have a history full of the evidence of God's grace and activity in their lives. And yet here they've come to a place where they're saying, God's just forgotten me. Doesn't care anymore. My cause. He couldn't care less. He's disregarded me. It's a strange place for a chosen people to get to. But you know, you and I can get to that place sometimes in life, where God doesn't seem to care, where it looks and appears that he's overlooked us, that he's not for us, that he's no longer close to us, but that he's distant, disinterested, spiritual distance. The tense of the word here, say and speak, is the present continuous. It's this: why do you keep saying? Why do you keep speaking? So this is not just a passing thought that they're tempted to think. This has become their new narrative, their new way of thinking, an entrenched way of thinking. And that is not a good place to be. You know, it may be that the last 15 months have brought you to a place where there's a new narrative that you're owning in your mind. A place where you are now saying to yourself some of the things that they were saying to themselves. God's distant, and I've been forgotten. Despite the fact that you're loved, despite the fact that you're chosen, despite the fact that as you can sit there this morning and look back and remember evidence of the grace of God and the activity of God in your own personal history as a believer, there's a new, hopeless, negative narrative that has begun to dominate your thinking. It's a my way is hidden from the Lord narrative. It's a my right is disregarded by God narrative. It's a God no longer cares narrative. God no longer feels close but distant. The well is definitely not overflowing for you. It's dry. You're definitely not soaring with eagles. You're hardly making it to the chickens. You're like the psalmist who looks back in Psalm 42 on what once felt so real and so enjoyable and what so once excited and motivated him. And yet in the present he felt so distant from God. He speaks of being like that thirsty deer. He remembers the time when he actually led the congregation in singing. But now he just feels so dry. Spiritual distance. Maybe you feel also worn down emotionally. There's two very similar sounding Hebrew words here, yorga and yoraf. They're translated weary and faint, and they refer to two things: the outward external circumstances that can grind us down in life, and the sense of having no internal resources to cope with what life has thrown our way. Weariness is what happens when we face a set of relentless, persistent challenges. We feel worn down, like a tire that's lost its tread. It's past its mileage. It's been worn down by countless thousands of miles. Or like an old worn-out carpet that's been trodden on for decades and has lost its thread. We can feel like we've got no emotional tread left. We can feel like we've got no strength, resilience, the slightest pothole, and we feel like we're going to burst. You feel a little bit like that? I know over the last 15 months there have been moments where I've felt like that. It's unusual for me. Feel emotionally frayed, like that carpet. You feel threadbare emotionally. You know, I don't think any of us would have predicted 15 months ago when this began that we would still be living with significant restrictions as a result of the pandemic today. We have faced a relentless, persistent, external challenge. And some of us are looking in ourselves and we're feeling like we are unable to cope anymore. We're worn out, we're weary. Well, let me encourage you, if you're faint, if you're weary, there's an invitation now to come and drink, to come and receive. And then finally, internal depletion is the other thing that we find here. This is the Hebrew word faint. It's when the tank really does run dry and we feel like we've got no juice left. We can't go on. We faint, we falter, we hit rock bottom. We've got nothing left to give. And the prophet here speaks of how even young men can reach this point. Those in the prime of life can experience this. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. Now we hear a lot, don't we, about the need to put first those who are most vulnerable and the elderly and those most at risk, which is a good thing. Those that are physically more vulnerable need to be considered and protected as a matter of priority. But what we have all been through has impacted people of all ages. Our children, our young people, those at school and college, those at university, young families trying to adapt to homeschooling and working from home and being under the same roof 24/7 in those early, perhaps, years of marriage when it can be struggle and difficult anyway. Singles who have found themselves extremely isolated and alone. And so if you're young and you feel like you've hit rock bottom, I want to say to you that there is absolutely no shame in that. You're thinking to yourself, hold on, I'm in the prime of life. I should be coping a bit better with this than I am. Even youths shall grow weary and faint. And even young men will fall down exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord will renew their strength. And that's where we get to with this, and that's what we're going to do once again now. There's an invitation for us. If you're experiencing something of spiritual distance, if you're worn out emotionally, if you're internally depleted, I want to invite you to come and to keep coming, to keep receiving, to drink afresh from that fountain, to know that the invitation is not to flap your wings harder or pedal faster or get back to work. The invitation is to come and receive. Come to this everlasting, inexhaustible God, to receive the riches of his grace once again, to be filled with his Spirit, to be lifted up. So we're going to do that, Amber.